The town of Hollow Pines wasn't on any map, at least, not anymore. It had been erased, buried beneath government records, forgotten by the world. But the town was still there, and so were its secrets. Eric Donovan had never heard of it until the night his GPS rerouted him, guiding him off the highway and onto a cracked 2-lane road leading through a dense forest. The trees were too tall, too thick, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the moonlight. The deeper he drove, the quieter it became. No birds, no insects, not even the sound of his own breathing. His gas gauge was dropping faster than it should have been. That was the first thing that told him something was wrong. The second was the sign that shouldn't have been there. Welcome to Hollow Pines. Population 347. Eric frowned. The town didn't exist on his GPS, and yet here it was, stretching out before him as the road widened into an empty main street. The houses were intact but abandoned, their windows dark, their doors slightly ajar. There were cars parked along the curbs, but they were covered in dust, untouched for years. The streetlights flickered erratically, some pulsing in a slow rhythm, as if breathing. Then he noticed something that made his stomach clench. The gas station at the end of the street, its neon sign buzzing weakly, had a man standing outside. The man wasn't moving, not even blinking. Eric slowed his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He could feel the man's eyes on him, though his face was obscured by the shadows. And then the gas station sign went out. Total darkness. When the lights flickered back on, the man was gone. Eric's chest tightened. He wasn't about to sit in his car waiting for whatever the hell that was. He opened the door and stepped onto the pavement, the cold air wrapping around him like invisible hands. His footsteps echoed. He made his way toward the only building with lights still on the Hollow Pines diner. Inside, the diner was perfectly preserved, like it had been frozen in time. The red booths were polished, the counters spotless. A faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, though there was no one inside. Then, he heard it, a plate clinking in the kitchen. His pulse spiked. Someone was here. Slowly, he approached the counter, peering through the swinging doors into the kitchen. The lights inside were dim, flickering erratically. Pots and pans hung neatly from racks. A single plate of steaming food sat on the counter. Eric took a step forward. The radio in the diner crackled to life. Static, then a voice. "You shouldn't be here." Eric's breath hitched. The kitchen door swung open on its own, revealing a shadowed figure standing at the back of the room. It was tall. Too tall. Its arms hung unnaturally long, fingers twitching. The diner lights went out. Total darkness. Eric spun around, stumbling backward, slamming into a booth. His breath was too loud, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. He reached for his phono signal. The radio crackled again. "You need to leave. Now." The lights flickered back on. The figure was closer. Its face was wrong, stretched and distorted, the mouth hanging open too wide as if frozen in a silent scream. Eric ran. He burst through the diner doors, nearly tripping over his own feet as he bolted toward his car. His headlights were still on, illuminating the empty road ahead. Except, it wasn't empty anymore. The man from the gas station was back, standing in the middle of the road. And this time, he wasn't alone. Dozens of figures stood behind him, lining the street. All of them motionless. All of them staring at Eric. The population sign flickered. Population 346. Eric's vision blurred. his pulse hammering. The figures took a step forward. His car wouldn't start. He twisted the key, nothing. The streetlights dimmed. One by one, the figures began to change. Their faces stretched, their mouths opened too wide, their eyes hollowed out into endless black pits. Their bodies contorted, growing taller, their movements unnatural, jerky, as if they were learning how to move for the first time. The radio inside his car crackled. "Join us." Eric's hands shook violently as he turned the key again. The figures broke into a sprint. His car roared to life. He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched as he tore down the road, his headlights cutting through the thickening fog. The town blurred past him, the diner, the gas station, the abandoned houses. And then a wall of trees appeared in front of him. He slammed the brakes. The road was gone. His GPS flickered back on. No route found. Eric's hands clenched the steering wheel. He had driven straight. There was no way the road had just vanished. A whisper brushed against his ear. "You never left." His rearview mirror darkened. Slowly, he turned his head. The passenger seat wasn't empty anymore. A woman sat there. Her skin was pale and stretched. Her mouth stitched shut with thick, black thread. Her eyes were missing. Her eyes were missing. And yet, she was smiling. Eric's scream was swallowed by the fog. The next morning, a new traveler arrived in Hollow Pines. A man, lost, his GPS failing. He saw the welcome sign at the edge of town. Population 347. Eric Donovan gasped awake. His breath came in sharp, ragged pulls, his chest heaving as if he had been suffocating in his sleep. The car engine was dead. The thick fog still loomed outside, swirling unnaturally around the trees. His passenger seat was empty again, but something had changed. The Welcome to Hollow Pine sign was still standing at the town's edge. But now, the population count had gone up. Population 348. His stomach clenched. Eric reached for his phone, his fingers trembling. Still no signal, no GPS, no internet, no connection to the outside world. His car wasn't moving. It wouldn't start. Something in his gut told him it wouldn't. He turned toward the road, leading out of town. Only the road was gone. A wall of trees stood in its place. Thick, ancient oaks with black, twisted bark, roots coiling through the asphalt like veins. The trees hadn't been there when he drove in, and yet they had always been there. Sputtered, the radio flickered on. Static. And then a voice. "You shouldn't have stayed." Eric's blood turned to ice. The rearview mirror darkened. A shadow moved behind the car. He turned. Nothing was there, but he could feel it. Something was watching him. His pulse pounded. He shoved the door open, stepping onto the pavement. The air was thicker than before, heavier, as if the town itself had grown denser, its presence pressing down on him. He wasn't alone. The town was different now. The houses on Main Street looked older, more decayed. The paint peeled in long, curling strips. The windows were shattered. The streetlights flickered, their glow barely cutting through the unnatural darkness. And worst of all, the gas station was open again. A neon sign buzzed faintly. The same sign that had gone dark the night before. And standing in front of it was the clerk. Only now, he had no face. His skin was smooth, featureless. A blank canvas stretched over his skull. But somehow, Eric could feel him smiling. His breath caught in his throat. The clerk raised one finger to his lips. Shh! Eric took a step back. The door of the gas station creaked open, and inside was himself. Eric's own reflection stood behind the counter, not a mirror, not a trick of the light, another version of himself, except it wasn't him. The other Eric tilted his head, grinning. "You should have left." Eric stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribs. The entire town breathed. A deep, groaning sound echoed through the streets, like wood and stone shifting beneath unseen weight. Something moved in the windows of the abandoned buildings. Figures, watching, waiting. Eric turned and ran. He sprinted down the empty street, past the diner, past the decayed houses, past the places that shouldn't exist. The town was changing around him. The buildings stretched taller. The roads curved where they hadn't before. New alleyways opened up dark and endless. He reached the church, the end of the street. The doors were open. Inside, candles flickered, and someone was waiting. A woman in black. Her face was hidden beneath a veil. Her hands, pale and thin, rested on the altar. She stood perfectly still, as if waiting for him. His body refused to move forward. Her head tilted. She knew his name. Eric Donovan. His blood ran cold. She lifted her hands. The candles flickered out. The town went dark. Eric wasn't in Hollow Pines anymore. He was somewhere else. The air was thick with mist. The ground beneath his feet was not pavement, not earth, but something soft, something breathing. The whisper started, not from one voice, from hundreds. A chorus of voices murmuring in unison. "You belong here now." His pulse thundered. He turned to run, but there was no exit. Only darkness. Only the voices. And then, hands grabbed his wrists. Then, cold fingers. They pulled him downward. Into the dark. Into the town. Into Hollow Pines. The next morning, a new traveler arrived in town. A woman lost. Her GPS failing. She saw the sign at the edge of the road. "Welcome to Hollow Pines." Population 349. The sky over Hollow Creek never seemed quite right. It wasn't just the way the clouds hung too low, or how the air always carried the scent of something damp and rotting. It was the silence. The way sound never quite traveled the way it should. Even in the middle of the day, the trees stood too still. The shadows stretched just a little too long, and no matter how many times Daniel Graves walked the same path, it always felt like he was going in circles. The town sat at the edge of a massive forest, its history lost to time. People didn't come here by accident. They either belonged, or they didn't last long enough to matter. Daniel had learned that the hard way. The town had been home once, long ago, a place he had left behind 15 years ago and swore never to return to. But the letter had changed everything. "Daniel, come home. She's still here." There was no signature, no return address, just those 6 words, scrawled in jagged, frantic handwriting. He had burned the letter the moment he read it, but the words had already burrowed into his mind, sinking in like rot, because he knew who they were talking about. The road to Hollow Creek felt longer than he remembered. Thick fog swallowed the path, clinging to the car like fingers trying to pull it back. The trees on either side of the road bent inward, their branches twisting unnaturally toward the pavement, as if whispering secrets in a language older than time. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He shouldn't be here, he knew that. But the dreams had started again. The house, the forest, the girl in white. Her voice had followed him, even after all these years. "You promised you'd come back." The car lurched forward violently, the tires skidding as if the road had vanished beneath them. Daniel barely had time to react before the world tilted sideways. A sickening crunch of metal, darkness, silence. He woke up in the middle of the road. His car was gone. Not wrecked, not overturned, just gone, as if it had never been there in the first place. The air was thick with mist, the trees looming closer than before. He was alone, or so he thought. The whispering started again. Faint, distant, but growing closer. Daniel turned slowly. A house stood at the end of the road. His house, or at least what was left of it. The front door was already open. The inside smelled of damp wood and something rotting just beneath the surface. The wallpaper was peeling, the wooden floor warped with age, but everything was exactly how he remembered it. Every light was off, but shadows still moved in the corners. Something had been waiting. His feet carried him forward on their own. A staircase loomed before him, leading up into the blackness of the second floor. The air grew heavier with every step, pressing against his chest like invisible hands. He reached the landing. The whispering stopped. Then, a door at the end of the hall creaked open, and a girl in a white dress stepped out. Her hair hung over her face, her bare feet leaving damp imprints on the wooden floor. Daniel couldn't breathe. It was her. The reason he had left. The reason he had never come back. 15 years ago, Eleanor Hadley had gone missing. She had been his best friend. They had been kids playing in the forest when they first heard the whispering. It had led them to a place they were never meant to find. Something had been waiting for them. Only Daniel had made it out. And now, she was standing in front of him. Her voice was soft. "You left me here." Daniel took a step back. His hand reached for the doorknob, but there was no door anymore. Only more hallway, stretching endlessly in both directions. Eleanor tilted her head, and then she smiled. Her lips pulled apart, stretching too wide, revealing something sharp and black behind her teeth. The whispering returned. It wasn't just coming from her. It was coming from inside the walls. From the floorboards beneath his feet, from behind his own reflection in the mirror. The house had never been empty. It had just been waiting for him to come back. The walls shifted. The house was closing in. Eleanor stepped closer. Daniel's heartbeat thundered in his ears. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned running toward the stairs. But the steps were gone. Only blackness remained, a yawning void that pulsed like a living thing. Something whispered his name from the dark. He ran anyway, falling, screaming. Then, silence. He woke up in his childhood bedroom. The walls were pristine, untouched by time. The morning sunlight spilled through the curtains, warm and golden, as if nothing had ever happened. A dream. It had all been a dream. Daniel sat up, rubbing his eyes. He let out a slow breath, and then he saw the footprints. Wet, bare, leading from the corner of the room to his bed. His pulse stopped. The whispering returned. Not from the walls, not from the mirror, but from inside the closet. Soft, slow. "You left me here." Daniel turned his head, trembling. The closet door creaked open. A hand reached out, and the room went black. The next morning, the sun rose over Hollow Creek. Daniel Graves was never seen again, but the house remained, waiting for the next person to come home. The town of Hollow Creek was exactly as he had left it, except Daniel wasn't supposed to be here. At least, that's what the voices kept whispering. His last memory was of the house, the closet door creaking open, the wet footprints leading to his bed. Then nothing. Now, he was back in Hollow Creek, standing in the middle of a road he didn't recognize, surrounded by buildings that shouldn't exist. Everything felt wrong. The sky was too still, the air too thick. The houses lining the street were familiar but off, as if someone had tried to reconstruct the town from memory and had gotten the details slightly wrong. The windows were too dark. The doors too closed. And the people, there were no people. Daniel's heart pounded as he turned in place. He wasn't dreaming, or at least he didn't think he was. Then he heard it, a single distant knock coming from the house at the end of the street. Eleanor's house. He didn't want to go inside. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to turn around, to run. But the air around him was thick, suffocating, pressing against him from all sides. There was nowhere else to go. Daniel took a step forward. The house was waiting. The front door stood slightly open, revealing only darkness beyond. His hands trembled as he reached for it. The wood was cold, unnaturally so, like something had drained every ounce of life from it. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him. The silence swallowed him whole. The house was alive. Daniel could feel it breathing around him. The walls pulsed faintly. The wooden floor creaked as if adjusting to his weight. The furniture was covered in thick layers of dust, but there were no cobwebs as if something still lived here. A familiar voice whispered from upstairs. "You finally came back." Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned his head toward the staircase. At the top, a shadow moved. A figure stood in the dim light Eleanor, but something was wrong with her. Her hair was too long, spilling over her shoulders like tangled vines. Her eyes were too black, swallowing the light. And when she stepped forward, her bare feet left wet footprints on the wood. Daniel backed away. "I tried," his voice cracked. "I tried to find you." Eleanor tilted her head. Then she smiled, and Daniel realized it wasn't Eleanor anymore. The house shifted. The walls stretched. The shadows deepened. The hallway behind him had disappeared, replaced by a single door. Eleanor stepped closer, her breath slow, deliberate. "You left me," she whispered. Her voice wasn't hers. It was layered, as if something else was speaking through her. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. "You're not real." Eleanor stopped. Then, her lips began to unravel. The stitches peeled away, revealing a mouth full of black void. And she laughed. Not a human sound, not something that should have existed in this world. The house began to close in. Daniel turned and ran. The door at the end of the hall swung open as he reached it. He stumbled forward and he was outside. Not in Hollow Creek, not anywhere familiar. The sky above him was red, shifting like liquid. The ground beneath his feet pulsed, the grass wilting as he stepped on it. The town was gone. In its place stood endless fields of black trees stretching for miles. Something moved in the distance. A figure. Watching. Waiting. Daniel turned, heart hammered. The house was gone, but Eleanor wasn't. She stood right behind him. Her eyes were missing. Her mouth hung open, too wide, too dark. And she whispered, "It's your turn now." The sky collapsed. The trees bent, unnaturally, their branches twisting toward him. The ground split open, revealing something moving underneath. The voices screamed. Daniel fell to his knees. Eleanor stepped forward, her hands reaching for his face. Her fingers were too cold, too sharp. "Stay," she whispered. He fought against the pull, his body feeling heavier by the second. Then, a light, faint, barely there. A sound, a train whistle. He woke up on the side of the road. The 8:45 train roared past him, its lights slicing through the fog. His clothes were damp, his hands covered in mud. His heartbeat thundered in his ears as he stumbled to his feet. He was back. Hollow Creek was behind him. The town looked normal. The sky was blue. Had it all been a nightmare? Then he looked down. Wet footprints led from the woods right up to where he had been lying, his breath caught in his throat. His shadow stretched unnaturally long behind him. And in the reflection of a puddle near his feet, Eleanor was smiling, waiting, watching. He ran. The next morning, Daniel checked into a motel miles away from Hollow Creek. He needed to get as far from that place as possible. The motel room was small, old, but quiet. The road stretched through the dense West Virginia forest, winding through mist-covered hills and trees that whispered even when there was no wind. The sun had long since vanished behind the mountains, leaving only the silver glow of the moon and the flickering headlights of Claire's car. She had been driving for hours, the GPS failing to connect, her phone flickering between static and dead silence. She hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour. Her fuel gauge blinked red. She needed to stop. That was when she saw it. A gas station. Old. Broken. Standing alone in the middle of the woods, its rusted neon sign hanging by a thread. Claire hesitated. She had never seen this place before. She pulled in anyway. The gas station was empty. No cars, no people. The pumps were ancient, their hoses cracked, the concrete stained dark with something that wasn't oil. Claire's hands shook as she stepped inside. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead. The store was filled with shelves of expired food, dust-covered soda bottles, and rows of magazines from decades ago. A single cashier stood behind the counter. He was too still, too pale. His name tag read Walt. His lips stretched into a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "You're lost," he said. It wasn't a question. Claire swallowed. "Yeah, my GPS isn't working." Walt's smile didn't move. "You should go back." Claire hesitated. I just need gas." The lights flickered. "You should go back," Walt repeated. Then he turned his head. Not in a normal way. Not like a human should. His neck twisted too far. His face stretched. His eyes too wide, too dark, too hungry. Suffocating. Claire's pulse thundered. She turned and froze. Through the store's glass window, she saw them. Figures. Standing at the edge of the forest. Still. Watching. Their heads tilted at an unnatural angle. Their mouths stretched into identical smiles. The same smile as Walt's. Her breath caught in her throat. "What is this place?" Walt's voice wasn't human anymore. "You're not supposed to be here." Claire turned and ran. She burst through the door, but the parking lot was gone. The road was gone. Only the gas station. And the forest. And the figures. Closer now. Smiling. Then, the lights inside the store went out, and Walt laughed. A deep, inhuman sound that echoed through the woods. Claire screamed. She ran. Through the trees. Through the impossible darkness. The figures moved with her. Not running, gliding. Their limbs twisting at wrong angles. Their eyes. Too many eyes. Everywhere. Blinking. Watching. Claire tripped, her hands sinking into the damp earth. She gasped for breath, then felt something grab her ankle. Cold fingers. Too long. Too sharp. She kicked. Screamed. The trees whispered her name. The ground shifted beneath her. And then, she wasn't in the forest anymore. She was in a room. The walls were covered in mirrors. Each one showed a different version of her. Some looked normal. Others, their faces were wrong. Twisted. smiling too wide. Their eyes black pits of nothing. One of them spoke. "You should have turned back." The mirrors shattered, and the figure stepped out, hands grasping, pulling, dragging her into the glass. Claire screamed. She woke up in her car. The morning sun spilled through the windshield. The gas station was gone. The forest looked normal. Her phone buzzed. GPS reconnected. Was it a nightmare? A hallucination? She grabbed her phone, then froze. Her reflection in the screen was smiling. She wasn't. Then, it blinked and whispered, "You never left." The screen glitched. A new message appeared. "Unknown number. Turn back before it's too late." Claire's hands shook. She looked up, and standing at the edge of the woods, the figures were still there, watching, waiting, smiling, and the gas station's neon sign buzzed to life. "Welcome home." Claire never spoke about the gas station again. She told herself it was a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion, a moment where her mind betrayed her. But that didn't explain the dreams, or the voices in her phone, or the way her reflection sometimes smiled back at her when she wasn't smiling. She left the mountains of West Virginia that morning, driving faster than she ever had before. She didn't look back, didn't slow down, and when she reached the first town she could find, she collapsed in her motel bed and didn't sleep at all. But the gas station never left her. Neither did they. The first message came a week later. Her phone buzzed in the middle of the night. No number, just a text. "Still lost?" Claire sat up, heart pounding. She stared at the screen. No sender, no way to reply. She turned her phone off and went back to bed. But the messages didn't stop. "You should have turned back. They're still watching. You're not supposed to be here." She blocked the number. It didn't help. She got a new phone. It didn't help, because the texts weren't coming from a number. They were coming from inside her phone. 2 weeks later, Claire found the first scratch. It was on the bathroom mirror in her apartment. A thin, jagged line like something had clawed at the glass. She didn't think much of it at first, until she noticed the second scratch. Then the third. And she realized the scratches weren't random. They were forming words. "Let me out." Claire's breath hitched. She stepped back, shaking. Then the mirror shifted, like water rippling, and her reflection smiled. Even though she didn't, Claire smashed the mirror. But it didn't matter, because the scratches kept appearing. On her windows, on her phone screen, on the inside of her car windshield. She started seeing them again. The figures, standing at the edge of crowds, at the far end of parking lots, at the foot of her bed in the middle of the night. She never saw them move, but every time she looked away, they were closer. Claire tried to escape. She booked a flight across the country. L.A., New York, somewhere far away from West Virginia. She didn't make it to the airport because her GPS stopped working again. And when she looked up, she was back on the road, back in the forest. The gas station stood there just like before. Except this time, the lights were already on. The neon sign buzzed softly. "Welcome home." Claire slammed on the brakes. Her hands shook. Her heart pounded so hard it hurt. She tried to turn the car around, but the road was gone. Only trees, only fog, only the gas station. And them. Waiting, watching, smiling. gas station door creaked open. A light flickered inside. Something was waiting for her. She didn't want to go in, but she didn't have a choice. Her body moved on its own. Like in a dream where you can't wake up, she stepped inside. The smell of rotting wood and old gasoline filled the air. The shelves were empty now. Dust covered the counters. And at the register, Walt was still there. Still wearing his name tag. Still smiling. "You made it back," he said. His voice was wrong. Too deep. Too many layers. Like someone else was speaking through him. Claire's pulse thundered. "Why am I here?" Walt's grin stretched too wide. "You never left." Claire's head spun. "This isn't real," she whispered. Walt blinked slowly. "You think you ever left this place?" His voice shifted, sounding more like her own. "You think you escaped?" The walls groaned. The air grew thick, heavy. Claire turned and saw herself. Her own reflection in the gas station window, but it wasn't copying her movements. It was staring at her, smiling. Her stomach dropped. The window rippled. Like water. Then, her reflection reached out and pulled her in. Claire woke up. In her bed. In her apartment. The city buzzed outside. Her phone vibrated. She looked down. No messages. No missed calls. Everything was normal. Was it a dream? A hallucination? She let out a shaky breath. It was over. She got up, went to the mirror. Her reflection was there. She touched the glass. Nothing happened. She let out a breath. But then, her reflection blinked, even though she hadn't, and it smiled. Then, softly, it whispered, "You never left." Her phone buzzed. She looked down. A new message. Unknown number. "Welcome home, Claire." The mirror cracked, and something stepped out. Then, darkness.